The yachts bobbed in the Solent, their white sails catching the summer light like paper lanterns strung across the water. The smell of salt air mixed with perfume and cigar smoke. The sound of champagne corks competed with the snap of canvas in the wind. And the Prince of Wales himself presided over the festivities, his portly figure moving through the crowded receptions with the easy grace of a man who knew everyone worth knowing. August 1873. The Isle of Wight, Cowes Week, the absolute apex of British society. If you wanted to be seen, you came to Cowes. If you wanted to make a deal, you came to Cowes. If you wanted to sell your daughter to a British aristocrat, you came to Cowes. And that's exactly what was happening. Somewhere in that glittering crush, a 19-year-old American girl with dark hair and darker eyes was about to be sold. Jennie Jerome had been bred for this moment. Her father, Leonard Walter Jerome, was the king of Wall Street, a man who had made and lost fortunes with the terrifying velocity that only Gilded Age capitalism could produce. His mansion on Madison Avenue at 26th Street featured a ballroom for 300 guests and a private theater seating 600. Testaments to wealth that seemed inexhaustible until it wasn't. Leonard raced horses, speculated in railroads, seduced opera singers, and raised daughters with equal intensity. When his affairs became too public even for New York's elastic standards, his wife Clara had taken their 3 surviving girls to Paris, where they learned French, curtsied to the Empress Eugenie, and waited for suitable husbands to appear. Jennie was the second daughter, the beautiful one, the clever one, the one Leonard had invested the most hope in. He didn't raise a daughter. He raised a product. He invested in her, like he invested in railroad stocks and racehorses. He bred her for a specific market, and then he shipped her to Cowes. Lord Randolph Henry Spencer Churchill noticed her across a reception room. He was 24 years old, the third son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, and he had a problem. Blenheim Palace, the family seat, was crumbling. The Churchill debts were crushing. As a third son, Randolph would inherit neither the title nor the estate, only the expenses of maintaining aristocratic appearances on the aristocratic income that no longer existed. What he possessed was the family name, a sharp intelligence, volcanic ambition, and absolutely no money of his own. He looked at Jennie Jerome and saw a solution. 3 days later, he proposed. 3 days. Randolph Churchill met a woman at a party and asked her to marry him before the week was out. The audacity of the timeline cannot be overstated. That's not romance. That's a business transaction conducted at emergency speed. Think about what that timeline reveals. Randolph didn't propose because he fell in love. Nobody falls in love in 3 days. Randolph proposed because he recognized opportunity and moved before it could escape. He saw Leonard Jerome's millions attached to a beautiful daughter, and he grabbed. Jennie accepted. Whether this was love or calculation on either side remains unknowable across the distance of a century and a half. What is certain is that both families exploded in opposition. The 7th Duke of Marlborough wrote to his son with aristocratic contempt barely disguised as paternal concern. From what you have told me, and what I have heard, this Mr. J seems to be a sporting, and I should think vulgar kind of man. It is evident he is of the class of speculators. He has been bankrupt once, and may be so again. Read that again. The Duke isn't saying Leonard Jerome is poor. He's saying Leonard Jerome is common, worse than poor, a speculator, someone who makes money by gambling rather than inheriting it. The Duke would rather his son starve genteel than prosper with American vulgarity. He demanded his son wait a full year before proceeding, a cooling-off period. Time for sense to prevail. Leonard Jerome, for his part, understood exactly what was happening. He'd spent decades in the shark tank of Wall Street. He knew a predator when he saw one. The Churchills wanted his money. His daughter was the delivery mechanism. Fine. He'd write protections into the contract. What followed was one of the most brutally practical marriage negotiations in Victorian history. The final settlement called for £50,000 to be settled on the couple, plus an annual income of £1,000 for Jennie's personal use, money that would be hers alone, controlled by her rather than her husband. This provision shocked the Duke. English wives did not have independent money. That was the point of marriage: consolidation of assets under male control. But Leonard Jerome had seen too many abandoned women to let his daughter enter marriage unprotected. He was selling her, yes, but he was writing protections into the contract. The ornament was purchased. The transaction was complete. The wedding took place April 15th, 1874, at the British Embassy in Paris. The Duke of Marlborough did not attend. The ceremony was modest, almost furtive, nothing like the grand society event either family might have orchestrated under happier circumstances. Jennie Jerome became Lady Randolph Churchill in a foreign chapel, surrounded by a small handful of witnesses, beginning a marriage that would reshape British political history in ways no one present could have imagined. What none of the guests knew was that the bride was already pregnant. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on November 30th, 1874, at Blenheim Palace, less than 8 months after the April 15th wedding. The official story blamed a fall. Lord Randolph wrote to his mother-in-law, "She had a fall on Tuesday, walking with the shooters, and a rather imprudent and rough drive in a pony carriage brought on the pains on Saturday night." Labor began Saturday night. Winston arrived at 1:30 a.m. Monday morning. The baby clothes were borrowed from a neighbor because the family had not prepared for such an early delivery. Nobody believed a word of it. The math is simple. If Winston was born November 30th, 1874, and the wedding was April 15th, 1874, that's 7.5 months. Full-term pregnancy is 9 months, which means either Winston was dramatically premature or Jennie was already pregnant when she walked down the aisle. Guess which option Victorian society chose to believe. Winston himself, when asked about it decades later, offered only dry wit. Although present on the occasion, I have no clear recollection of the events leading up to it. The pregnancy had likely predated the marriage. The hasty wedding made sense now. The ornament had been purchased in a hurry because the merchandise was already in use. None of this mattered to the Churchills. They had their money. They had their heir. The transaction was complete. Jennie settled into her role. She hosted dinners. She charmed guests. She appeared at the right events in the right gowns with the right expressions of wifely devotion. She played the piano beautifully and spoke French like a native, and could hold her own in political conversation without ever appearing to dominate her husband. She was exactly what the Churchills had paid for, a beautiful American ornament for their English drawing rooms. And then her husband started dying. The first warning came as early as 1874, the same year as the wedding, the same year as Winston's birth. According to medical historians who have reconstructed Lord Randolph's case, he consulted a specialist in Paris during that year and received a prescription for mercury-based medication. Mercury was the standard treatment for one disease, and one disease only: syphilis. The details are fragmentary. The consultation may have occurred before the wedding or after. The source of infection was never conclusively established, though later rumor attributed it to a chambermaid at Blenheim. What survives is Lord Randolph's response to the prescription. He told his friend Julian Osgood Field that he had chucked the whole damn lot away, refusing the mercury treatment because its side effects, bad breath, tooth loss, visible deterioration, would effectively advertise his condition to society. The cure would reveal the disease. Better to gamble that the disease might never progress. It was a bet against time, a bet against biology, a bet that Lord Randolph Churchill would lose in the worst possible way. But in 1874, that loss was still years away. In 1874, the symptoms were minor. The marriage was new. The baby was healthy. The political career was just beginning. And Jennie Jerome Churchill, the ornament purchased for decoration, had no idea what she had married into. The years passed. Winston grew from infant to toddler to small boy, shuttled between nannies and nurseries while his parents pursued the endless social obligations of London society. Jennie established herself as a hostess, learning the intricate choreography of aristocratic entertaining, which families to cultivate, which to avoid, which dinner invitations carried political weight, and which were merely social. She was doing exactly what she'd been purchased to do. She was being an ornament, Lord Randolph, meanwhile, threw himself into politics. He entered Parliament in 1874 as a backbencher for Woodstock, the family's pocket borough, a seat his father essentially controlled, guaranteed to any Churchill who wanted it. For the first few years, he was unremarkable, just another young aristocrat marking time in the Commons, voting as his party directed, making no particular impression on anyone. But something was building in him, an ambition, a rage, a desire to matter that seemed to exceed what his circumstances required. Third sons of dukes didn't need to dominate Parliament. They could coast on family connections, collect sinecures, live comfortable lives of gentleman leisure. That wasn't enough for Lord Randolph. He wanted more. He wanted everything. By 1878, the cracks were becoming harder to ignore. Lord Randolph started visiting a physician named Dr. Oscar Clayton. The presenting complaints were ordinary enough on the surface: sciatica, rheumatism, joint pain, the kind of ailments any gentleman might develop after too many hours on horseback or too many nights in drafty country houses. But sciatica and rheumatism in a man not yet 30 years old, in a man who had consulted a syphilis specialist just 4 years earlier. Medical historians have speculated that these symptoms may have represented neurosyphilis, specifically inflammation of the membrane surrounding the spinal cord. The symptoms told a story to anyone who knew how to read them. Lord Randolph complained of these symptoms to Dr. Clayton in 1878 and again in 1879. He was treated for rheumatism. He was told to rest. He was given the standard remedies of the day. But Jennie noticed. A wife notices when her husband can't walk properly. A wife notices when he winces getting out of bed. A wife notices when he grips the arm of a chair to lower himself into it, when he pauses at the top of a staircase to brace himself, when he declines invitations to go riding because his back is troubling him again. A wife who shares a bedroom notices everything, and by 1879, Lord Randolph wasn't just experiencing physical symptoms. His behavior was changing too. The mood swings that would later become infamous were already emerging. He could be charming 1 hour and savage the next, witty at dinner and vicious by dessert. His temper, always sharp, was becoming unpredictable. People who had known him for years started exchanging glances when he entered a room. Something was wrong with Lord Randolph Churchill. The marriage continued. On the surface, everything looked normal. Lord and Lady Randolph Churchill attended the right parties, made the right appearances, said the right things. They welcomed their second son, Jack, in 1880. They maintained the elaborate fiction that every aristocratic marriage of the era required: the performance of devotion, of partnership, of domestic happiness. But performances have cracks, and Jennie was starting to see them. 1882. The year everything changed. Between March and July of that year, Lord Randolph suffered from what contemporary doctors described as inflammation of the mucous membrane, a condition severe enough to prevent him from attending Parliament for months. Medical historians have speculated that these symptoms may have represented condylomata lata, the syphilitic growths that appeared during the secondary stage of the disease. The illness was prolonged. It was debilitating. It was impossible to hide from a wife who shared his household, observed his body, and tracked his calendar. Picture a London townhouse in early spring, the curtains half drawn against weak March sunlight, the smell of coal smoke drifting up from downstairs, and somewhere in the house, a man who won't come out of his bedroom. Lord Randolph Churchill had been absent from Parliament for weeks. Then weeks became months. March bled into April. April crawled toward May. The official explanation was vague. Something about his health, something about needing rest. The newspapers printed polite notices about his temporary indisposition. Everyone agreed that Lord Randolph would return when he was feeling better. But Jennie knew the truth. She knew it because she lived in that house. She slept down the hall from that bedroom. She saw what the newspapers didn't print and what society didn't discuss. By 1882, Jennie Jerome Churchill knew something was catastrophically wrong with her husband. The psychological weight of this realization defies easy description. She was 28 years old. She had been married for 8 years to a man she had known for 3 days before accepting his proposal. She had borne him 2 sons, Winston and Jack, and she had every reason to believe the partnership would continue for decades. Instead, she was confronting a disease that Victorian society considered the ultimate mark of moral degradation. Syphilis was not merely a medical condition in the 1880s. It was a social death sentence. The disease was associated with prostitution, with infidelity, with the kind of sexual excess that destroyed reputations irrevocably. A woman whose husband had syphilis faced impossible choices. If she revealed the truth, she would be ruined by association. If she concealed it, she was complicit in a lie that touched every aspect of her public life. If she divorced him, she would lose her social position entirely, and probably her children as well. There was no good option. There was only management. Try to imagine that realization creeping in. Not a single dramatic scene. Real understanding creeps in gradually, like water seeping under a door. It starts as a suspicion, then a worry, then a question you don't want to ask because you already know the answer. Think about what Jennie knew by 1882. She was 28 years old. She had been married for 8 years to a man she'd known for 3 days before accepting his proposal. She had given birth to 2 sons, Winston, now 7, and Jack, just 2. She had built a life in English society. She had cultivated connections, thrown dinner parties, charmed the right people, said the right things. She had done everything an ornament was supposed to do. And now she was discovering that the investment her father had made had purchased something defective. The cruelest part? She couldn't leave. Divorce in Victorian England wasn't just difficult, it was social suicide. A woman who divorced her husband lost everything, her children, her reputation, her place in society, even if she had cause, even if her husband was dying of a disease he'd contracted through infidelity. The stigma attached to the wife. She would be ruined. So Jennie sat in that townhouse in the spring of 1882, watching her husband hide from the world, understanding what was killing him, and calculating her options. Option 1, leave, lose everything. Watch her sons grow up without their mother's influence, die alone and forgotten, just another discarded woman. Option 2, stay and crumble. Become the tragic wife. Nurse him through the decline. Weep at the right moments. Accept condolences gracefully. Fade into respectable widowhood when it was over. Option 3, stay and fight. Jennie Jerome Churchill chose to fight. What made Jennie's situation uniquely cruel was the timing. Lord Randolph's political career was accelerating precisely as his body was failing. He had entered Parliament in 1874 as a backbencher for Woodstock and spent years in obscurity. What transformed him was the creation of the Fourth Party in 1880, a small band of conservative rebels who attacked their own party leadership with theatrical ferocity. Just 4 members, Lord Randolph, Sir Henry Drummond Wolfe, John Gorst, Arthur Balfour. They were outnumbered, outranked, and outgunned, but they had something their opponents lacked. They had Lord Randolph's tongue. His speeches were weapons. He eviscerated opponents with wit so sharp it drew blood. He coined phrases that entered the political vocabulary overnight. Tory democracy. The idea that the Conservative Party should actually represent working people, not just protect aristocratic privilege. Revolutionary for its time, terrifying to the old guard. The newspapers loved him. The public loved him. His own party leadership feared him. And with every speech, with every triumph, with every headline, Lord Randolph Churchill climbed higher. The disease was advancing. His career was exploding. His wife was watching both trajectories with growing unease. And here's what makes this story so devastating. The same qualities that made him brilliant may have been symptoms of the disease that was killing him. Syphilis in its secondary and early tertiary stages can produce something that looks exactly like political genius. Manic energy, grandiose thinking, reckless confidence, the kind of self-belief that lets you walk into a room full of enemies and start swinging. The medicine and the poison were the same substance. The infection destroying his brain may have been powering the wild ambition that made his career possible. Think about that for a second. Let it sit. The mood swings his colleagues noticed. The sudden brilliances followed by equally sudden collapses. The volcanic rages that made even his allies afraid of him. The gambling instinct that led him to bet everything on political maneuvers that no cautious man would attempt. Was that just personality? Or was it already the disease, rewiring his neural pathways, stripping away the inhibitions that would have made a healthy man more careful? We can't know. Nobody can. The line between who Lord Randolph was and what syphilis made him is impossible to draw with any certainty. But Jennie had a front row seat to all of it. Every mood swing, every explosion, every night when the brilliant orator who dominated Parliament came home and raged at servants over nothing. And here's the thing about Jennie Jerome that nobody talks about enough. She was just as ambitious as her husband, just as intelligent, possibly smarter, if we're being honest. She had the same instinct for power, the same ability to read a room, the same talent for knowing exactly which lever to pull and when. But she was a woman, in Victorian England, which meant she couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't exist politically except through the men she married. Everything she was, every ounce of strategic brilliance, every political insight, every talent for coalition building and alliance management had to flow through her husband's career. She couldn't pursue power directly. She could only pursue it through him. The ornament had the brain of an operator, but operators weren't allowed to show their hands, so she operated from the shadows, and she was extraordinary at it. And here's what fighting looked like for a woman in 1882. It looked like dinner parties. It looked like correspondence. It looked like charm deployed with the precision of artillery. It looked like running a political machine from behind a silk fan while everyone in the room believed you were merely decorating it. The transformation was gradual, so gradual that even the men closest to Lord Randolph didn't notice it happening. They saw Lady Randolph Churchill hosting dinners. They saw her making introductions. They saw her laughing at the right jokes and remembering the right names and asking the right questions about constituents and committees and legislative calendars. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see because it would have violated everything they believed about women in power, was that she was running the operation. Think about what that meant in practical terms. Lord Randolph Churchill's political career was built on relationships, on alliances cultivated over years, on favors exchanged and debts accumulated and loyalties tested and retested through 1,000 small interactions. And Lord Randolph, by 1882, was becoming unreliable. The mood swings that had always been part of his personality were getting worse. He could be brilliant 1 hour, witty, charming, the most magnetic man in any room, and then something would shift. His temper would flare. He'd say something cutting, something inappropriate, something that made allies uncomfortable and enemies gleeful. The volcanic energy that made him a parliamentary star was becoming unpredictable, dangerous. So Jennie stepped in. She started by managing the social calendar. Not obviously, not in any way that Lord Randolph would have noticed or resented, just taking over, making sure the right people were invited to dinner, making sure difficult conversations happened when her husband was having good days, not bad ones, making sure that when he was irritable or erratic, there was always an excuse ready. A headache, a prior engagement, a convenient illness that explained why Lord Randolph couldn't attend this particular event. She cultivated the wives. This was her master stroke. Victorian politics was a male domain, but Victorian society was run by women. The hostesses who controlled the dinner tables controlled who talked to whom. The wives who managed the households managed the information flow. Jennie made herself indispensable to this network. She became the woman other women wanted at their parties. She became the connection between political factions, the neutral ground where enemies could meet, the lubricant that kept the machinery of power running smoothly. And she started writing, not novels, not poetry, correspondence, the endless stream of letters that kept a political operation alive, thank you notes and congratulations and condolences and requests and reminders, the paper trail of obligation that bound allies together. when Lord Randolph's hands trembled too badly to hold a pen, when his attention wandered, when the words wouldn't come. Jennie picked up the slack. The men who received those letters had no idea. They saw Lord Randolph Churchill's seal. They assumed Lord Randolph Churchill's hand. What they were actually reading was Jennie's political mind translated into her husband's voice. The dinners she hosted at the Churchill townhouse became legendary in London political circles. Men who came to her table left feeling heard, feeling that they mattered, feeling that the Churchill cause was their cause. She understood instinctively what her husband grasped only intermittently. Politics wasn't just about speeches and votes. It was about relationships cultivated over years, favors exchanged and remembered, alliances built through shared meals and shared confidences. Randolph would deliver the speeches, Jennie would manage the relationships that made those speeches matter. Randolph would announce the positions, Jennie would cultivate the journalists who would cover those positions favorably. Randolph would take the meetings. Jennie would make sure the right people were in those meetings to begin with. She was building a political machine, one dinner party at a time, one charming conversation at a time, one strategic friendship at a time, and nobody was supposed to notice, because that was the game. The ornament couldn't be seen operating. The moment anyone suspected that Lady Randolph Churchill was actually running strategy, the whole facade would collapse. A woman with political ambitions was unseemly. A woman with political power was unacceptable. She had to achieve everything while appearing to achieve nothing. The strain of that performance is almost unimaginable. Smiling through dinners while your husband's behavior grows more erratic, making excuses for his absences, covering for his outbursts, maintaining the fiction that Lord Randolph Churchill was fully in control while knowing in your bones that he was slipping. Meanwhile, Lord Randolph's public career was reaching its zenith. The Fourth Party had done its work beautifully by attacking their own party's leadership, by positioning themselves as the energetic future against the tired past. Randolph and his allies had transformed British conservatism. The phrase Tory democracy was everywhere now. In 1885, the Conservatives returned to government under Lord Salisbury. Randolph was appointed Secretary of State for India, a senior cabinet position, real power. The trajectory was unmistakable. Within a year, he'd be promoted again to Chancellor of the Exchequer, one of the four great offices of state. Lord Randolph Churchill, at 37 years old, was one of the most powerful men in England. Lord Randolph Churchill, at 37 years old, was also showing signs of advancing disease. The symptoms were accumulating now. By the mid-1880s, he was experiencing bouts of tiredness that left him unable to function for days at a time. In August 1885, he complained of fatigue and something he described as congestion of the lungs. Jennie watched. Jennie managed. Jennie kept the machinery turning. The boys, Winston was 10 now, Jack was 5, saw their mother mostly at a distance. She was present in their lives in the way that Victorian mothers of her class were present, supervising nannies, overseeing education, appearing at appropriate moments. But her attention was elsewhere. Her real work was keeping their father's career alive, while his body slowly failed. Winston would later write about feeling abandoned during these years, desperate for parental attention that never quite came, writing letters that went unanswered or answered only briefly. He loved her with the fierce, frustrated love of a child who knows he's been placed second to the political machine, second to his father's career, second to the performance that consumed both his parents. Jennie wasn't cruel. She wasn't indifferent. She was simply overwhelmed. Running a dying man's political operation while maintaining her social position, while raising 2 sons, while navigating hostile in-laws, while hiding a family secret that could destroy everything. There wasn't enough of her to go around. Something had to give. The children gave. It would shape Winston forever. That hunger for recognition, that desperate need to prove himself, that driving ambition that would eventually carry him to the pinnacle of world history. You can draw a straight line from the lonely child at boarding school to the man who stood against Hitler. The boy who couldn't get his mother's attention, became the man who demanded the world's attention. Then came December 1886. Lord Randolph had been Chancellor of the Exchequer for less than 6 months. He was at the absolute peak of his power. Prime Minister. That was the next step. Everyone could see it. Lord Randolph submitted his budget proposals. The budget included dramatic cuts to military spending. The War Office was horrified. The Admiralty was furious. Lord Salisbury, trying to manage his fractious cabinet, refused to support the cuts. This is where it all fell apart. Lord Randolph had a strategy that had worked for him before. Threatened to resign. Force the other side to capitulate. It was a power play he'd used successfully throughout his career. When you're the most popular minister in the government, when newspapers hang on your every word, when the party base loves you and fears you in equal measure, resignation is leverage. The Prime Minister won't let you go. He can't afford to, so you threaten to walk, and you get what you want. Randolph wrote the resignation letter. He didn't consult his wife. He didn't ask anyone who might have counseled caution. He just did it, sent the letter, threw down the gauntlet, bet everything on the assumption that Lord Salisbury would fold rather than lose his most valuable minister. Lord Salisbury accepted the resignation. Just like that. No negotiation. No attempt to woo Randolph back. The Prime Minister simply said yes. Thank you for your service. Goodbye. Lord Randolph Churchill had destroyed his political career in a single evening. The throne he'd been climbing toward for 15 years, gone. The network Jennie had been building, threatened. The alliances, the favors, the obligations, the carefully cultivated relationships, all of it rendered meaningless by one catastrophic miscalculation. Here's what makes this worse. By December 1886, Lord Randolph Churchill's judgment was already compromised. The disease that was killing him affects the brain. It impairs impulse control. It damages the ability to assess risk. It makes grandiose thinking seem reasonable, and catastrophic gambles feel inevitable. The same infection that had given Randolph his manic energy, his reckless confidence, his willingness to take on anyone and anything, that infection was now destroying his capacity to know when to stop. He didn't just make a bad decision. He made the kind of decision that a healthy mind would have recognized as insane. Threatening to resign when you're not prepared to actually leave, that's not strategy. That's suicide. Jennie would have stopped him. If she'd known, if he'd asked. She was better at reading political situations than he was. She understood that Lord Salisbury wasn't bluffing. She could have saved him. She wasn't given the chance. After December 1886, Lord Randolph Churchill would never hold political office again. A different woman might have given up at this point. The project had failed. The investment was lost. The ornament had done everything an ornament could do, and it hadn't been enough, because the man she was supporting had sabotaged everything from the inside. Jennie didn't give up. She pivoted. If Lord Randolph's career was over, there was still Winston. 10 years old in 1886. Difficult, demanding, desperate for attention, but also, she could see it already, brilliant, ambitious, hungry in the same way his father had been hungry, but without the disease eating away at his brain. The network Jennie had built for Lord Randolph didn't have to disappear. It could be preserved, maintained, ready for the next generation. The relationships she'd cultivated, the obligations she'd created, the alliances she'd forged, all of it could be repurposed. The ornament who had run the machine for Lord Randolph would run it for Winston. But first, she had to get through the remaining years. Years of managing a man whose decline was accelerating now, visibly, publicly. Years of maintaining the fiction that Lord Randolph Churchill might yet recover, might yet return to power, might yet fulfill the promise everyone had once seen in him. The 1890s arrived like a slow-motion catastrophe. By now, Jennie had been managing her husband's condition for nearly a decade. She had learned the rhythms of his illness, the good days when he could almost pass for the man he used to be, the bad days when his eyes went vacant and his words came out scrambled, the terrible days when she had to make excuses to house guests, cancel appointments, explain absences that grew longer and more frequent with each passing season. But the 90s were different. The disease was accelerating. In 1890, Lord Randolph experienced heart palpitations, not the racing pulse of nerves before a speech, not the flutter of excitement or anger. Something deeper, something wrong. His heart was struggling in ways it hadn't struggled before. She watched him that year with new terror. Every stumble, every pause, every moment when his hand shook as he lifted a glass. The man who had once dominated rooms now seemed to be fighting just to exist in them, and the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that everyone else was starting to notice. London society had always been a gossip machine. It ran on whispers and speculation, on the careful observation of who was rising and who was falling, and by 1890, the whispers about Lord Randolph Churchill had grown impossible to ignore. "Have you seen him lately? Did you hear what he said at Lady So-and-so's dinner? Something's not quite right with him, is there?" The speculation hummed through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs. Nobody said the word out loud. Nobody dared name the disease that everyone suspected. But the knowing glances, the meaningful pauses, the way conversations would suddenly stop when Jennie entered a room, she felt all of it. The performance of normalcy had become her full-time occupation. Think about what that required. Every day, Jennie woke up knowing her husband was dying of a disease that carried maximum social shame. Every day, she dressed herself in the finest gowns, arranged her famous dark hair, and walked into rooms full of people who were watching for cracks in the facade. Every day, she maintained conversations, hosted dinners, cultivated political relationships, and projected absolute confidence in a future that didn't exist. She was acting. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for years. And beneath all of it, a question that must have haunted her. What happens when I can't maintain this anymore? Because Lord Randolph's condition was deteriorating in ways that couldn't be hidden forever. His speech had always been his greatest weapon. That voice that made the House of Commons tremble, that ability to articulate complex ideas with devastating precision, that rhetorical brilliance that had made him the most quoted politician in England. Now the weapon was failing. He struggled to find words, simple words, words he had used thousands of times. He would begin a sentence with perfect confidence and then falter, groping for a noun that refused to come, a verb that had slipped away into the fog gathering in his brain. In May 1894, he confessed to his friend Wilfrid Blunt, "I know what I want to say, but damn it, I can't say it." 8 words that contained an entire tragedy. Imagine being Lord Randolph Churchill, a man whose entire identity was built on his ability to speak, to persuade, to dominate through language, and feeling that ability dissolving. Imagine knowing you're becoming someone else, someone smaller, someone diminished, someone who can no longer trust his own mouth to deliver what his mind commands. His hands trembled now, not occasionally, constantly. He shook when he lifted a teacup. He shook when he signed his name. His gait had become unsteady. The confident stride of a man who knew he owned every room he entered had transformed into something shuffling and uncertain, and there were moments of confusion, episodes where he seemed to lose track of where he was or what he was doing, conversations where his responses had nothing to do with the questions being asked. Jennie could rescue him from almost any situation before anyone fully registered that something was wrong. A gentle touch on his arm, a slight redirection of conversation, a charming anecdote that drew attention away from whatever strangeness had just occurred, almost. But the disease was outpacing her abilities. Through all of this, Jennie was doing something else, something that revealed just how far ahead she was thinking. She was positioning Winston. Her elder son was in his late teens and early 20s during these years, attending Sandhurst, beginning his military career, dreaming the same dreams of political glory that had animated his father. Jennie watched him with calculating eyes. She saw the ambition, she recognized the talent, and she understood something that Lord Randolph, in his deteriorating state, could no longer grasp. Winston was the future, not Randolph, not the political comeback they kept pretending was possible, Winston. So while she managed her dying husband's present, she was building her son's future. She cultivated relationships that would benefit him. She maintained connections he would need. She kept the Churchill name prominent in political circles, not because it would help Randolph. Nothing could help Randolph now, but because it would help Winston when his time came. She was playing a long game, a game that extended beyond her husband's death, a game she was determined to win. And then Lord Randolph decided he wanted to travel. It was 1894, the worst possible time. His condition was deteriorating rapidly. Anyone who spent more than an hour with him could see that something was catastrophically wrong. A world tour, months of travel through foreign countries, exposure to strangers who didn't know to make allowances, the physical stress of constant movement was insane. Lord Randolph insisted. He had convinced himself that travel would restore him. Fresh air, new scenery, distance from the whispers that followed him through London. He believed, or claimed to believe, that the journey would be therapeutic, that he would return revitalized. Jennie knew better. She had watched this disease progress for 12 years. She understood what was happening to her husband's brain. She knew that no amount of travel was going to reverse the damage. The world tour wasn't going to save him. It was going to expose him, but she couldn't stop him. This was still 1894. Jennie was still a Victorian wife. Her role was to support her husband's decisions, not to override them, even if those decisions were suicidal. So she prepared. A doctor was hired to accompany them. A small staff was assembled to manage logistics. The itinerary was planned. They would travel east through Egypt, then Burma, then Japan, across the Pacific to Vancouver, then by train through Canada, a journey of thousands of miles through dozens of countries, lasting months, undertaken by a woman who knew she was escorting her husband toward his grave. They departed England in the summer of 1894. What followed would haunt Jennie for the rest of her life. Imagine being her on that ship, watching the English coast disappear behind you, knowing you might never see your country again with your husband alive, knowing that every mile you travel is a mile further from the doctors who understand his condition, the friends who know to cover for him, the familiar rooms where his episodes could be concealed. She had spent 12 years building walls around Lord Randolph's illness. Now those walls were coming down, one continent at a time. The world tour became a death march, and Jennie Jerome Churchill was going to walk every step of it. There was no escape now, no turning back, no pretending that any of this was going to end well. The ship left England in the summer of 1894, and everyone pretended it was a vacation. That was the official story. Lord Randolph Churchill, distinguished statesman, was embarking on a world tour for his health, a change of scenery, fresh air. Nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. Just a gentleman of leisure exploring the globe with his beautiful American wife. The reality was something else entirely. Jennie stood on the deck as the English coastline disappeared behind them, and she knew. She knew this wasn't a vacation. This wasn't a cure. This was a controlled retreat. Better to have her husband deteriorating in foreign hotels than in the House of Commons. Better to have his episodes witnessed by strangers who didn't know his name than by colleagues who remembered what he used to be. The early weeks were almost tolerable. Egypt was hot and overwhelming and different enough to distract him. The pyramids, the Nile, the ancient monuments that made English politics seem petty and small. Randolph photographed everything, scribbled in journals, asked endless questions of local guides. Jennie managed the schedule. She managed the accommodations. She managed the servants and the luggage and the thousand small crises that traveling in the 1890s inevitably produced. And she managed her husband. When he grew agitated, she soothed him. When he grew confused, she redirected him. When he said something inappropriate to a local dignitary, she smoothed it over with her smile and her charm and her fluent French. She was running a diplomatic operation disguised as a marriage. But the facade was cracking. Burma was worse. The heat was crushing. The distances were longer. Randolph's stamina collapsed entirely. He couldn't walk for more than a few minutes without exhaustion. His speech became nearly unintelligible in the humid afternoons. The tremors in his hands grew worse. He dropped things. He stumbled. He forgot where he was, what day it was, why they had come. Jennie watched him struggle to dress himself one morning in Rangoon, his fingers fumbling with buttons he'd fastened 10,000 times before, and she had to leave the room so he wouldn't see her cry. This was the man who had terrified Parliament. This was the man who had outmaneuvered Gladstone. And he couldn't button his own shirt. They pressed on. Japan. More temples. More monuments. More nights in strange beds, while Randolph grew increasingly confused. The paranoia was new. Or rather, it had always been part of his personality, that combative suspicion that had served him so well in politics, but now it had metastasized into something darker. Everyone was plotting against him. The servants were stealing. The doctors were lying. Even Jennie was suspected of betrayals he couldn't quite articulate but felt with absolute certainty. She bore it. She had been bearing it for years. What was a little more? By the time they reached the Pacific, the pretense was gone. There were no more photographs, no more journal entries. Randolph sat in his cabin for hours, staring at nothing, responding to questions with words that didn't connect to sentences. Jennie spent the Pacific crossing alone. She walked the decks at night when she couldn't sleep, watching the stars wheel overhead in configurations she didn't recognize. Southern Hemisphere stars. She was 40 years old. She had been married for 20 years. She had been managing her husband's illness for 12 of them. And now she was sailing across an ocean that seemed to go on forever, with a man who wasn't really there anymore. What do you do when the person you've built your life around disappears while still breathing? Jennie didn't have answers. She just had duty. She just had the next task, the next crisis, the next decision that had to be made, because someone had to make it, and there was no one else. They needed to get him home. The train journey across Canada was a nightmare. Days of rattling coaches and endless prairie, and her husband growing worse by the hour. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep properly. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to recognize her, sometimes lost in hallucinations. The other passengers stared. The porters whispered. Jennie smiled at everyone and explained that Lord Randolph was simply exhausted from their travels, that the journey had been more taxing than expected, that he would be fine once they reached home. No one believed her, but no one contradicted her either. That was the privilege of being Lady Randolph Churchill. Even when your lies were transparent, people let you tell them. They reached the Atlantic coast. They boarded a ship, and they crossed back toward England, toward the life they had left behind, toward the reckoning that had been postponed for so long. Randolph didn't recognize the English coastline when it appeared. He didn't recognize much of anything anymore. The brilliant mind that had once constructed parliamentary speeches of devastating precision was producing only noise. They arrived in London in late December 1894. The Christmas season. The city was festive, lights in windows, carolers on corners. Randolph was taken to his mother's house on Grosvenor Square. The Duchess of Marlborough had never liked Jennie, had never forgiven her for being American, for being purchased, for being necessary. But now none of that mattered. Her son was dying. The doctors came. They examined. They conferred. They offered nothing but palliative care. There was no treatment. There was no hope. There was only waiting. Jennie waited. She sat nearby while her husband's condition worsened. She listened to the sounds, the shouts, the moans, the silences that were somehow worse than the noise. She had visitors, friends who came to pay their respects, politicians who wanted to be seen doing the proper thing, family members who hovered awkwardly. She received them all. She maintained appearances. She performed widowhood before she was actually a widow, because that was what she had always done, performed whatever role was required. January came, cold, gray, the kind of London winter that seeps into your bones. Lord Randolph Henry Spencer Churchill died in January 1895. He was 45 years old. He had been Chancellor of the Exchequer. He had been the most feared debater in Parliament. He had been the man who was going to be Prime Minister until he wasn't. Winston, 20 years old and home from Sandhurst, would serve as a pallbearer. Jack, 14, would stand by his mother at the funeral. And Jennie. Jennie would stand in that church and watch them lower her husband into the ground and feel, what? Relief, exhaustion, grief for a man who had died years before his body stopped working. Freedom, terrible, terrifying freedom, from a role she had played for 2 decades. She was 41 years old. She had been purchased. She had been decorated. She had been displayed. She had run a political machine. She had managed a dying man. She had done everything that was asked of her and more. Now what? The body was barely cold when the machinery of death kicked into motion. Undertakers arrived within hours. Black crepe appeared on the doors. Curtains were drawn throughout the house. The servants moved in whispers, and somewhere, in the hushed chaos of a household reorganizing itself around absence, Jennie Jerome Churchill sat in a room that suddenly belonged to her alone. 41 years old, exhausted, and for the first time since she was 19, free. That word, free. It sounds like liberation. It sounds like relief. But in that moment, in that darkened house, freedom felt more like vertigo. The ground had disappeared. The structure she had been holding together for 13 years had collapsed, and now she was standing in the wreckage, trying to remember what she wanted when she wasn't managing someone else's destruction. The newspapers were kind. They had to be. Lord Randolph Churchill had been too famous, too connected, too politically significant for the press to dwell on the circumstances of his death. The obituaries celebrated his brilliance. They mourned his potential. They described a great statesman cut down in his prime by mysterious illness. The fiction held. The performance continued. Even in death, Jennie was still managing the narrative. The thing about prolonged illness is that it steals grief in installments. By the time death actually arrives, you've already mourned 100 smaller deaths. The death of the man you thought you married, the death of the future you imagined, the death of intimacy, of partnership, of the ordinary daily rhythms that hold a marriage together. Jennie had been grieving Lord Randolph Churchill for 13 years. So when people asked how she was coping, Jennie smiled the appropriate sad smile and said the appropriate sad words. And if her grief felt more like relief, she kept that to herself. The financial situation was complicated. Lord Randolph had left debts, but Jennie had her own money. The settlement her father had negotiated back in 1874, the annual income that was hers alone, regardless of what happened to her husband. Leonard Jerome had seen too many abandoned women to let his daughter enter marriage without a safety net. Now that safety net was all she had. It wasn't enough to live lavishly, but it was enough to live independently. The question was, what kind of life did she want? Victorian society had very clear expectations for widows of Jennie's class. Black dresses for at least a year, limited social appearances, no dancing, no theaters, a gradual retreat into respectable invisibility. Jennie was 41 years old. By Victorian standards, her useful life was over. But here's the thing about being an ornament for 20 years. You learn exactly how the machine works. You see where the power flows. You understand which relationships matter and which ones are decorative. You map the invisible networks that connect money to influence to access to results. You know that society's rules are negotiable if you have enough leverage. You know that scandal only destroys you if you care what people think. You know that the men who run the world are no smarter than you are. They just had the luck to be born male. And you know, after 13 years of watching your husband's mind dissolve while you held everything together, that you are capable of more than anyone has ever given you credit for. Winston. That was the immediate priority. Her son was 20 years old, freshly commissioned as a cavalry officer, convinced of his own destiny, but lacking the connections to make that destiny happen. He was talented, yes, ambitious certainly, But talent and ambition meant nothing without access. Without the right introductions, the right assignments, the right opportunities to distinguish himself where people who mattered would notice. His father had been supposed to provide all of that: the Churchill name, the political connections, the network of allies and obligations that Lord Randolph had built over 2 decades. All of it should have transferred to Winston, like an inheritance. But Lord Randolph's disastrous resignation in 1886 had burned most of those bridges. His erratic behavior in the years since had burned the rest. Jennie's network wasn't. She had spent 13 years building relationships that had nothing to do with her husband's career. She had cultivated journalists, charmed hostesses, befriended politicians who came to her dinners and left feeling like they owed her something. She had been building her own network, parallel to her husband's, invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. Now her husband was dead, and her network was intact. Winston was going to need introductions. He was going to need editors who would publish his dispatches. He was going to need people who would vouch for his character when opportunities arose. He was going to need money. Jennie could deliver all of it. But here's where it gets interesting, because Jennie wasn't just thinking about Winston's future. She was thinking about her own. For 2 decades, she had been defined entirely by her relationship to men. Leonard Jerome's daughter, Lord Randolph Churchill's wife, Winston and Jack's mother. Her accomplishments were always translated through male achievement. Her intelligence was always channeled through male careers. Her ambition was always dressed up as devotion to someone else's dreams. What if she stopped doing that? What if, instead of retreating into respectable widowhood, she simply refused to disappear? The thought was terrifying. It was thrilling. It was probably impossible. But Jennie had watched her husband destroy himself by gambling wrong on a political resignation. She had watched him throw away everything they'd built because he misjudged his leverage. She had learned from his mistakes. And the lesson she'd learned was this: the only gambles worth taking are the ones where you're playing for yourself. The black crepe still hung on the doors. The condolence letters still arrived. Society still expected Jennie Jerome Churchill to perform the role of tragic widow, fading gracefully into the background of history. But somewhere underneath the mourning dress, a decision was crystallizing. The ornament who had run the machine for 13 years wasn't going to put herself back on the shelf. The woman who had managed a dying man's political career wasn't going to stop managing just because the man was dead. She was going to do something no one expected. She was going to live, not just survive, not just endure, not just exist in the margins of other people's stories. She was going to live loudly, publicly, scandalously, on her own terms, in ways that would make Victorian society gasp and gossip and never, ever look away. And that brings us to the strangest part of this whole story, the part that nobody in 1874 could have predicted, the part that transforms a tale of purchased brides and dying men into something that reshapes how you think about history itself. What exactly did the Churchills buy when they purchased Jennie Jerome? 47 years earlier, in 1874, the Churchill family had purchased Jennie Jerome for the equivalent of £50,000. They had bought her because Blenheim Palace was crumbling, because Lord Randolph needed American money to fund his political ambitions, because the Duke of Marlborough had looked at his ledgers, looked at his son, and concluded that dignity wasn't going to pay the bills. They thought they were buying an ornament, a pretty American girl with dark hair and darker eyes who would host their dinners and bear their airs and fade gracefully into the background of British aristocratic life. That was the transaction. A decoration, a display piece. They had no idea what they were actually buying. Think about what Jennie Jerome became in those decades. Think about the distance between that 19-year-old girl at Cowes, watching yachts bob in the summer light, and the woman who reshaped everything she touched. She became the operator behind the Churchill political machine. She ran her husband's career from the shadows for 13 years, while he slowly, publicly, shamefully disintegrated. She managed his correspondence when his hands shook too badly to write. She cultivated his allies when his mood swings made him impossible to deal with. She raised his campaign funds when his judgment had deteriorated past the point of rational decision-making, and when he finally died, raving, ruined, 45 years old, she didn't retreat into respectable widowhood. She redirected her formidable skills toward her son's career. Her real achievement was the man she raised, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, born 7 months after the wedding in 1874. The demanding child who wrote letters from boarding school begging his mother to visit, to write, to pay attention. The troublesome adolescent who scraped through Sandhurst on his third attempt. The young officer who needed his mother's connections. That boy, that struggling, attention-starved, academically mediocre boy. Jennie saw something in him, or maybe she just refused to let the Churchill investment fail. Either way, she poured everything she had into his career. The network she had built managing his dying father's political life, all those dinners, all those cultivated relationships, all those favors exchanged and remembered, she redirected the entire machinery toward her son. She badgered newspaper editors to publish his dispatches. She lobbied for him to be included in expeditions. She edited his early manuscripts. When he needed money, she found it. When he needed introductions, she made them. When he needed someone to believe in his destiny before anyone else could see it, she was there. The skills she had developed managing Lord Randolph's career transferred perfectly to managing Winston's. The only difference was that Winston wasn't dying. Winston had time. Winston had decades ahead of him to become whatever Jennie's ambition and his own determination could make him. Winston had already served as Home Secretary, as First Lord of the Admiralty. He had been in and out of government more times than most men held a single position. His greatest moment was still years away, but the foundation had been laid, the connections had been made, the fire had been lit in a boy who grew up starving for his mother's attention and learned to channel that hunger into world historical ambition. Jennie never saw Winston stand in the House of Commons and promise to fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, and in the streets. She never watched her son become the voice of a civilization refusing to surrender to darkness, but she made it possible. Here's the thing about investments. They don't always pay off the way you expect. Sometimes you buy one thing and get something completely different. Sometimes the transaction you thought was decorative turns out to be the foundation of everything that follows. The Duke of Marlborough bought Jennie Jerome because he needed American money to prop up a failing estate. He was thinking about leaking roofs and mounting debts and the desperate mathematics of aristocratic survival. He looked at Leonard Jerome's daughter and saw a solution to immediate financial problems. He never imagined he was purchasing the political brain that would create the man who saved Western civilization. Think about that chain of causation. Really think about it. 1874, a transaction at Cowes, money changing hands, a pretty American girl becoming Lady Randolph Churchill. 1882, a wife discovering her husband is dying, making the choice to run the operation instead of crumbling. 1895, a widow refusing to disappear, redirecting her formidable skills toward her son's career. 1940, a prime minister standing alone against Nazi Germany, his voice carrying across the Atlantic, his words rallying a nation that had no reason to believe it could survive. The ornament the Churchills bought for their drawing rooms produced the lion who roared back at Hitler. And nobody saw it coming. Not the Duke, who objected to this Mr. J as vulgar. Not Lord Randolph, who married Jennie for her father's money and never suspected she was the more capable politician. Not Victorian society, which watched her host dinners and assumed she was merely decorative. They all looked at Jennie Jerome Churchill and saw what they expected to see, an ornament, an American interloper who had bought her way into British aristocracy. They missed the operator, the woman who ran the machine when the machine's official operator was dying, the mother who turned her political network toward her son's career with the same systematic intensity she had applied to her husband's, the widow who refused to accept the role society assigned her and invented a new one instead. The ornament who saved Britain, because here's the final irony, the deepest one, Lord Randolph Churchill's disease, the disease that destroyed him. that forced Jennie into the operator's role, that turned their marriage into a performance of devotion while she ran the actual operation. That disease was probably contracted before they ever met. Before the wedding at the British Embassy in Paris, the Churchills bought damaged goods, and the damaged goods produced Winston Churchill. The disease that killed the father created the conditions for the mother to become the political genius the family actually needed. The tragedy that ended Lord Randolph's career began Jennie's. The death that freed her at 41 gave her years more to shape British history through her son. It's almost too perfect, too neatly ironic. The kind of story that seems like it must have been invented, but it wasn't invented. It happened. It happened because a Brooklyn heiress was bred for the European marriage market and ended up running the Churchill political machine. Because a woman who was purchased to be decorative turned out to be the most dangerous political operative her generation produced. Because the investment the Duke of Marlborough made in his family's survival paid off beyond anything he could have imagined, and not at all in the way he intended. Jennie Jerome Churchill died in 1921 from complications after a fall, gangrene from a broken ankle that required amputation, and hemorrhage that followed. Her son Winston delivered the eulogy. The newspapers printed respectful obituaries remembering Lady Randolph Churchill's beauty, her charm, her unconventional widowhood. None of them understood what they had lost. The ornament had run the machine. The machine had made Winston. The ornament had saved Britain from across 2 generations. And the whole thing started with a transaction at Cowes, a 3-day courtship, a hasty wedding, and money that the Duke of Marlborough thought he was spending on decoration. The Churchills got exactly what they paid for. They just didn't know what they were buying.